Good morning, everyone. Congratulations on everything that you've accomplished so far. My name is Hannah Clark, and my keystone is called Publicity with a Purpose, Examining Messages of the Peace Corps, and I was advised by Professor Victor Coelho. So my keystone is actually a historical analysis which explores the roots of the Peace Corps and examines the agency's messages for publicity and recruitment. I first asked, how did the Peace Corps exemplify American idealism during the 1960s? And second, I explored how the agency has projected its image throughout its more than 50 years of international service. In today's presentation, I will discuss each section of my paper, from the groundwork research to the rhetorical and visual messages, and finally, the people who served. I'm majoring in both communication studies and American studies, which is a field that uses interdisciplinary approaches to learn what it means to be American. This project looks at how the Peace Corps used messages for its own publicity to recruit volunteers while also publicizing throughout the world what it means to be an American. My interest in the Peace Corps began years ago when I traveled abroad for 10 days to complete a service project and returned home feeling as if 10 days was not enough. A few years later, I noticed a trend in widespread criticism for what's known as voluntourism. And while the Peace Corps is distinct from service programs with price tags, the cautions about voluntourism have opened the discussion to criticisms of the Peace Corps, and I wanted to see if these assessments had any validity. I'm a big proponent of the Peace Corps, so my project was in no way a moral judgment of the agency, rather an assessment of its image. The Peace Corps has dealt with its skeptics from the beginning, but the dialogue about international service has grown more prominent within the past 10 years or so. In a New York Times opinion piece called Too Many Innocents Abroad, former Cameroon director of the Peace Corps, Robert L. Strauss, articulated the current concerns about the work of the Peace Corps. Namely, that the Peace Corps typically sends the same demographic of volunteers abroad, generalist college students, even though the Peace Corps host countries may have grown out of their need for this group. Strauss wrote that host countries now have plenty of their own college graduates to do general labor, and what they need is more experienced professionals. So why hasn't the Peace Corps been able to recruit skilled personnel? I argue that the Peace Corps remains rooted in its idealistic origins, promoting itself as a postgraduate learning experience rather than as a solution to the real needs of less developed nations, which it very well might be. For background knowledge, I consulted a range of texts that extensively covered the Peace Corps' past and politics. And I used former KHC professor Andrew Bacevich's book, The Limits of Power, as a framework for understanding the decline of American exceptionalism. My paper supports that we are no longer an exceptional society, and it investigates the origins of the Peace Corps as gathered from my sources. How President Kennedy established the Peace Corps actually helps to illustrate the intentions behind its creation. Political and economic uneasiness came to a head at the end of the 1950s, and underlying Cold War tensions harbored during this time drove American fears of communism. Young Americans sought a sense of purpose during a time of uncertainty, and Kennedy hoped to spread freedom throughout the so-called Third World as a product of his New Frontier administration. The Peace Corps became a part of Kennedy's New Frontier in February 1960, when on the campaign trail, someone asked Kennedy his opinion of congressional bills calling for Americans to volunteer abroad. So he looked into it, and he asked for position papers on a national youth service program in September. Kennedy first garnered interest in the Peace Corps during an extemporaneous speech at the University of Michigan, but he named the agency just days before the November election in what is now referred to as his Cow Palace speech. Just a month after his inauguration, Kennedy issued an executive order to establish the Peace Corps, and by the end of August 1961, the first group of Peace Corps set out to serve in Ghana. So what began as a talking point for Kennedy throughout his campaign won over the idealistic hearts and minds of young Americans. The Peace Corps exemplified the notion of American exceptionalism, but what does that term really mean? Well, prior to the end of American exceptionalism, politicians were quick to distinguish America and, according to Bacevich, remake the world in what we imagine to be America's image. Linda Kerber, former American Studies Association president, explains how the Cold War gave way to a mindset of exceptionalism, which then drove foreign policy. And scholar Michael Denning defined American exceptionalism as three-pronged, including the concept of the frontier, which also drove 1960s foreign policy. So how did Peace Corps messages exemplify foreign policy driven by exceptionalism? We'll start with the agency's mission, which does include mention of host countries' needs, as you'll see. However, the final 2 points emphasize cultural exchange. Created to spread democracy throughout the Third World, the Peace Corps sends a positive image of America and teaches foreign nations about American democracy. We're all familiar with Kennedy's inaugural call to ask for what you can do for your country. But in his early rhetoric about the Peace Corps, from his speech at the University of Michigan to his remarks for the establishment of the Peace Corps, both of these focus on the needs of developing countries and on the potential for volunteers to fulfill a purpose. This balance, however, was not reflected in the Peace Corps recruitment materials. The first Peace Corps campaign, created in 1961 by Ad Council in collaboration with other agencies, publicized the Peace Corps as the toughest job you'll ever have. The campaign said joining the Peace Corps meant helping your country, making America a better place, and also that if you're a positive person, you'll benefit from the job. 30,000 people applied to the Peace Corps by the following year, but few had knowledge about the issues that they actually signed up to tackle. 40 years later, when the Peace Corps had already sent tens of thousands of volunteers to serve all over the world, the agency's messages had not yet changed direction, and they did not advertise how much the agency had accomplished in the way of international development. The messages of the new 2003 campaign remained largely focused on the applicant's opportunity to become a volunteer. The new campaign told applicants that life is calling and challenged them to go to the distance. And these messages appealed to an audience that the Peace Corps had been recruiting since its earliest days, young, recent college graduates with a desire to fulfill a calling. And that's exactly who responded to Peace Corps messages. In the third part of my paper, I used 2 cases to understand the average profile of a person who served and their motivations for joining. The subjects of both cases, one a 1962 study on the first group to travel to Cameroon, and the other a 2001 survey collected from volunteers in Mali, and they both fit similar profiles. In both cases, the majority of volunteers were white, middle class, young, and liberal, with most holding liberal arts degrees and approaching their projects with general knowledge and a desire to embark on adventure. While this profile of volunteers suited the Peace Corps well in the beginning, there is currently a clear call for a more diversified applicant pool in terms of age, motivation, and experience. And if the Peace Corps has shifted from the idealistic spread of freedom to a means of tangible change in less parts of the world, the agency will need to evolve its messaging in order to recruit more experienced professionals to complete the tasks that host countries' locals are unable to do themselves. The most recent campaign they had was created in 2013, and the messages sort of remain just as vague as they always have. The smallest change can make the biggest difference, as seen in the slide here. Down at the end, there isn't an app for this. Clearly, a slogan like that is going to appeal to a younger audience who's engaged with apps rather than more professional experiences, people who have been gaining experience over years of time. And the Peace Corps, if they want to hire technical professionals, their campaigns will need to evolve, highlighting the gaps for experts to bridge. For future campaigns to show the mechanics of structural issues in people's homes or the number of how many foreigners have received job offers after learning English from an American, that would appeal to people like engineers, teachers. So in conclusion, the Peace Corps has gradually shifted away from the ideals of American exceptionalism from which it originated in the 60s. However, the agency continues to focus its messaging on the opportunities it provides for volunteers. So for the Peace Corps to address criticisms of people, such as former Cameroon country director Strauss and others, its messages will need to emphasize its solutions to real issues facing people every day all over the world. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes, Sam.
So, first of all, that was very interesting. I'm wondering, I have 2 points here. Do you feel that also, and you touched on this a little bit, do you feel that in this evolving message, were you able to look at the 3 prongs of the Peace Corps about technical assistance and then also better understanding as Americans and also better understanding the host country where they're serving? So do you think that maybe the message is more about shifting just to that second part of the message where now the emphasis is just on cultural exchange, and how willing or how open would older generations of Americans be to fostering that sort of an exchange? Because my own personal convictions is that it's the younger, idealistic, maybe liberally educated, not necessarily so though, that would be willing to foster that kind of an exchange more readily than older Americans that might have outdated or more deeply entrenched views and biases and things of that nature. And then also, I was wondering, could you speak to some of maybe the practical limitations of getting experienced professionals into the Peace Corps? Because, for instance, they have a lot of obligations. They have their careers, they have their families, they like their settled lives or stability, whereas, young people that are just coming out of college really don't have a whole lot of strings attached, and they can, afford, so to speak, to make this kind of a long-term commitment. So if you could speak to any of that.
Those are great questions, and for those of you who don't know, Sam will actually be going to Cambodia this summer with the Peace Corps. So he's highly invested, and I'm really excited to talk to him about it. Your first question touched on the 3 prongs, how the mission of the Peace Corps had 3 different parts. And in my research, most interesting part for me was actually to look at the 2 studies, because I got to see what were the actual motivations behind real people when they went to places like Mali, and what were they going there for. And I think you make a good point that there is a practicality behind it. The kind of people that want to leave America for 2 years and sacrifice a lot generally aren't the people that are married and have kids and have houses and mortgages. So it's definitely, I think, kind of it's almost idealistic in a way for the Peace Corps to be wanting professionals to be joining, because they haven't seen any they've seen more experienced people join in recent years, which is great, but people who are experienced in their fields are going to have to sacrifice a portion of their career in order to go over and give of their time. So yeah, I don't know that just because there are practical issues doesn't mean there's a possibility of someone out there who is willing to sacrifice that time, but I think it's at least worth looking into, especially since people who have been a part and been officials in the Peace Corps before have seen this need for it. Yes, Professor Campbell.
So it's another demographic not well represented in this room. That's retired people, and they're being picked up in a lot of different areas. What has the Peace Corps done in that regard? And do you have any numbers on that?
I don't have numbers. I think I have numbers in my paper, not on the moment with me now. But in the past, I would say 20 years or so, they have made a concerted effort to actually go after people. So what we're seeing is, rather than people that are currently in their career, it's people that have not yet begun their career and people who have almost sort of finished their career. So there's those 2 demographics. I think much higher numbers of people who are retired than people who are in the field currently, but even bigger numbers still on that untrained group. So I think that retired pool is definitely something that they will continue to pull from. Yes.
Thank you for a lovely presentation. I really like the way that you put it between, is the Peace Corps about giving an experience to the people who go, or is it about doing something for the country? My question is also, if you are looking into how they advertise, has the Peace Corps done targeted recruitment at BA level schools of engineering, schools of public health? There are people with undergraduate degrees that have skills.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. The Peace Corps definitely does recruitment besides through public service announcements, in terms of getting to talk to current students through different recruitment networking events. And there are actually different standards that a college would need to meet in order for the Peace Corps to even visit them, and BU is one of the lucky schools that the Peace Corps does come to recruit from. But I guess it might just come down to the fact that people who do have degrees in more technical fields tend to want to go right into those fields rather than spending their time elsewhere. So it's unfortunate, but I think maybe, hopefully, through something like public service announcements and just kind of changing the whole image of it, maybe turning the Peace Corps into something where you can actually start using your skills right away, rather than something that might seem like a waste of time or a sacrifice. Yes.
Do you think, in terms of recruiting more advanced professionals, there's not a negative competition, but a competition with organizations like Doctors and Engineers Without Borders? Because I've known medical professionals who they do seek to do service, and they gravitate towards these or some sort of religious mission where they can spend shorter amounts of their time. So does the Peace Corps need to kind of imitate some of these other organizations that allow for, or at least have somehow made professionals more comfortable in taking the time to go abroad to volunteer?
That's a great question. I think my hypothesis behind that would be an organization like Doctors Without Borders is actually called Doctors Without Borders. So people who want to be a doctor somewhere else in the world are more likely to join that just because of what it's called. And so you're right, there definitely is a competition there for the Peace Corps. And I think it might seem a little bit antiquated to certain people. It's definitely more well established, but in terms of providing opportunities for people who do have those skills, it's pretty obvious why they would go elsewhere. And I think the Peace Corps would really do with kind of, as I've explained, like reimagining itself. Not that it needs to change its name, but by creating advertisements, by targeting doctors, engineers, in particular, the way those organizations do, they could definitely see a higher number of recruitment in those areas.
I think that's actually the last question we have time for. Not to cut things off, but we do have to get to the next one. So
thank you.